In the early handling of Nikola Tesla's recovered materials, what appeared at first to be a routine archival transfer quickly unfolded into something far less straightforward. Inventory logs, technical papers, and classified evaluations did not always align with one another, and small inconsistencies began to form a larger pattern that resisted simple explanation. Across different stages of review, the same archive seemed to shift shape depending on which record was consulted, as if parts of the documentation were never meant to fully connect. As you follow this investigation, you move through FBI entry logs, alien property office records, sealed evaluations, and heavily redacted files spanning decades of handling. Each chapter brings you closer to a different anomaly hidden within the same materials, from missing inventory pages and conflicting assessments to unexplained references to experiments never verified. What emerges is not a single discovery, but a sequence of gaps and contradictions that steadily reshape the archive itself. The FBI enters room 3327. The winter air over Manhattan carried a muted stillness in early January 1943, the kind that seemed to settle over the city without warning, softening even the sharp outlines of its tallest buildings. Inside the New Yorker hotel, life moved with its usual rhythm, guests passing through polished corridors, elevators rising and falling without pause. Yet behind one closed door on the upper floor, something had come to an end without announcement. There had been no public attention, no immediate recognition of significance, only the quiet discovery of a man who had spent decades shaping the unseen forces of the modern world. What remained in that room, however, would soon draw attention not for who he was, but for what he had left behind. Nikola Tesla was found on January 7, 1943, in room 3327, where he had lived alone for years, increasingly withdrawn from public life. Hotel staff, concerned after days without contact, entered and discovered his body. News of his death spread quickly through official channels, but what followed was not handled as an ordinary passing. Within a day, representatives connected to the US government moved to secure his belongings, acting under wartime authority that allowed intervention when materials were considered potentially sensitive. Though Tesla had been a naturalized American citizen since 1891, the nature of his work, and the claims he had made in his later years, introduced a level of uncertainty that officials did not ignore. The entry into room 3327 was deliberate and controlled, carried out with an awareness that the contents of the space might extend beyond personal effects. Federal agents, along with individuals assigned to assess technical materials, began a methodical process of cataloguing what Tesla had left behind. The room itself was modest in appearance, containing little that suggested the scale of the ideas he'd pursued. Papers were stacked in uneven piles, notebooks filled with calculations and diagrams, and various documents arranged without any clear system that an outsider could immediately follow. There was no visible laboratory, no active machinery, only the remnants of work that had been conducted largely in isolation. What drew immediate attention was not the condition of the room, but the volume and nature of the documents. Tesla had continued writing extensively in his later years, producing notes that range from detailed technical descriptions to theoretical outlines of devices he believed could reshape modern warfare and communication. Among these were references to a directed energy weapon he had publicly described as Teleforce, a concept he claimed could project concentrated beams of particles over long distances. While such ideas had never been demonstrated, their presence in written form, combined with the geopolitical climate of World War II, gave them a weight that could not be dismissed outright. Agents worked through the materials with caution, aware that much of what they were handling was difficult to interpret without specialized knowledge. Diagrams appeared alongside dense mathematical expressions, some clearly related to Tesla's earlier, well-documented work in alternating current and electromagnetic fields, while others seemed to extend beyond established applications. The distinction between proven invention and speculative theory was not immediately clear, and this ambiguity shaped the way the materials were treated. Nothing was discarded. Everything was preserved, recorded, and prepared for further examination. Beyond the loose papers and notebooks, the contents of the room pointed to a larger collection that was not immediately visible. Tesla was known to have stored much of his work in trunks, and records indicate that numerous boxes were associated with his residence at the hotel. These were not all kept within the confines of room 3327 itself, but their connection to Tesla meant they fell under the same scrutiny. The initial entry into the room was therefore only the beginning of a broader operation, one that extended beyond a single space into a coordinated effort to secure everything he had left behind. The decision to involve technical experts came quickly. The government required an assessment that could distinguish between impractical ideas and those that might hold strategic value. This led to the involvement of electrical engineer John G. Trump, who was tasked with reviewing Tesla's papers. His role would come after the initial cataloguing, but even in those early moments inside room 3327, it was evident that the materials demanded more than routine handling. They represented decades of thought, much of it recorded without the expectation that anyone else would need to understand it. As the cataloguing continued, the atmosphere in the room shifted from one of quiet observation to focused examination. Each document was treated as a potential piece of a larger puzzle, though the full picture remained unclear. Some notes referenced experiments that had never been publicly demonstrated, while others revisited earlier concepts with added complexity. The absence of clear conclusions in many of these writings added to the challenge, leaving those who handled them with fragments rather than finished designs. What made the situation more unusual was the contrast between Tesla's public image in his final years and the implications of what was being uncovered. To many, he had become a reclusive figure, known more for bold claims than for active contributions. Yet the material in room 3327 suggested that his work had not simply ceased, it had continued in a form that was largely hidden from view. Whether these efforts had produced anything functional remained uncertain, but the intent behind them was unmistakable. The process of securing the room and its contents was completed without public visibility, carried out as part of a controlled response to a potentially sensitive situation. By the time official statements began to emerge about Tesla's death, the most critical phase of this operation had already taken place. The room had been entered, its contents examined, and the foundation laid for a deeper investigation into what Tesla had left behind. And within those carefully gathered papers, something remained that no inventory could fully explain. The Office of Alien Property takes control. In the background of a world at war, certain decisions were made in offices few ever saw. They did not begin with urgency in the public sense, nor did they announce themselves through visible action, but instead moved through quiet channels where authority was defined long before it was ever exercised. These were systems designed for moments when uncertainty carried risk, when the unknown could not simply be left unattended, and when control, even without complete understanding, was considered necessary. It was within this atmosphere, far removed from the corridors of the New Yorker hotel, that a response to Nikola Tesla's death was already taking shape. During the early 1940s, the United States had established a legal framework that allowed the government to take control of property deemed sensitive during wartime. The foundation of this authority traced back to the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, which had been expanded and adapted over time to meet the demands of global conflict. Under these provisions, property connected to foreign nationals or considered strategically significant could be seized, held, and examined. By the time of World War II, these powers had become part of a broader system designed to prevent information, resources, or technology from falling into the wrong hands. Among the agencies operating within this framework was the Office of Alien Property Custodian, tasked with managing assets that fell under such classifications. Its role was administrative on the surface, cataloguing, safeguarding, and controlling property, but its authority extended into areas where legal ownership became secondary to national security. The office had already handled cases involving businesses, patents, and financial holdings linked to enemy nations, operating with a level of discretion that rarely entered public awareness. Its involvement typically followed a clear pattern, one defined by identifiable foreign ties. What made Tesla's case stand apart was that this pattern did not fully apply. By 1943, he had been an American citizen for more than 50 years, having been naturalized in 1891 after emigrating from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His work had been conducted largely within the United States, and his contributions to electrical engineering were foundational to the country's infrastructure. Yet despite this, the same mechanisms used to control foreign-linked property were invoked in relation to his belongings, introducing a level of ambiguity that was not easily explained. Despite his citizenship, Tesla's work carried implications that extended beyond personal ownership. In the years leading up to his death, he had spoken publicly about concepts that suggested new forms of defense technology, including a device he claimed could project concentrated energy over long distances. These ideas, while never demonstrated in a verified setting, were documented in his writings and had been communicated to officials and the press. In a time defined by rapid technological advancement and global conflict, even unproven claims could not be dismissed without examination. At the centre of the government's response was not a confirmed invention, but the possibility that Tesla's papers contained information that could hold strategic value. His concept of Teleforce, often described as a particle beam weapon, was presented by Tesla as a means of national defence, capable, in theory, of creating an impenetrable barrier against aerial attack. While scientists of the time expressed skepticism about its feasibility, the idea itself introduced enough uncertainty to warrant attention. It was not necessary for the concept to be fully realised. The mere chance that it could be developed by others was sufficient to justify caution. Without public announcement, responsibility for Tesla's belongings shifted into federal oversight. This transfer did not take the form of a single, visible action, but rather a series of coordinated steps carried out under established authority. The materials collected from his residence, including documents and stored trunks, were placed under controlled conditions, where access could be limited and examination conducted without external interference. The process reflected the broader wartime approach to sensitive information: secure first, understand later. The handling of Tesla's property followed a procedural path, defined by documentation and authorization, rather than immediate interpretation. Each item was accounted for, preserved, and prepared for review by individuals with the appropriate technical background. The emphasis was not on drawing conclusions in that moment, but on ensuring that nothing of potential importance was overlooked. This methodical approach created a record of possession, but not necessarily a clear understanding of what had been taken. Questions surrounding the legal basis for applying these measures to Tesla were not openly discussed. Official records confirm the involvement of federal authorities and the use of wartime powers, yet the reasoning behind specific decisions remained largely within internal channels. The distinction between precaution and necessity was not clearly defined, leaving observers with documented actions but limited explanation. In this sense, the process itself became part of the mystery, shaped as much by what was withheld as by what was recorded. On paper, the justification aligned with the broader logic of wartime security, where uncertainty was treated as a risk that required containment. However, Tesla's circumstances did not fully match the conditions under which these powers were typically exercised. He was not connected to an enemy state, nor were his assets tied to foreign control in any direct way. The application of such authority in his case suggested that the concern lay not in who he was, but in what he might have left behind. While newspapers acknowledged Tesla's death and reflected on his contributions to science, they offered little insight into the extent of government involvement that followed. The public narrative remained focused on his life and legacy, leaving the handling of his work largely unexamined outside official circles. This separation between what was known and what was done reinforced the sense that the most significant developments were occurring beyond view. Within administrative records, the process was defined by structure and order, yet the absence of a detailed explanation created a space where interpretation became unavoidable. The materials themselves would later be reviewed, assessed, and in some cases returned, but the initial decision to take control set the tone for everything that followed. It established a framework in which Tesla's work was no longer simply a collection of personal papers, but a matter of controlled interest. In that quiet assertion of authority, the reasons for taking control seemed to deepen rather than resolve. 80 trunks removed under guard. In the days following Nikola Tesla's death, a series of quiet removals began to take place within the New Yorker hotel. There was no public announcement to mark the beginning of this process, no visible disruption that would have suggested anything unusual to those moving through its corridors. Life in the building continued in its familiar rhythm, yet behind that normality, controlled activity was unfolding in spaces that had recently been occupied by one of the most unusual scientific minds of the previous century. What was being gathered did not belong to a single moment, but to a lifetime of work that had accumulated in ways few outside his private circle had ever fully seen. Records would later point to a number far larger than expected for a single occupant of a hotel room. Accounts commonly refer to dozens of trunks, often cited as around 80 in total, each connected to Tesla's stored belongings at the time of his death. The figure itself carried weight, not because it was unusual for a long life of collected materials, but because of what it implied about the volume of work that had never been formally published or fully organised. In contrast to the modest surroundings of his final years, the quantity suggested a far greater scope of intellectual output than what was publicly visible. Many of these items had been stored in trunks, sturdy containers filled with papers, notes, and technical material accumulated over decades of continuous experimentation and thought. Tesla's habit of preserving his work in this manner had developed over time, especially during his later years when he worked more in isolation. Inside these containers were handwritten calculations, engineering sketches, correspondence, and typed manuscripts, some tied to well-known areas of his research, others less clearly connected to any established project. The trunks themselves offered no external indication of their contents, their significance entirely dependent on what they concealed. Each piece was handled under supervision, with the process unfolding in a manner that suggested more than routine removal. Federal oversight ensured that the transfer of materials followed strict procedural control, with attention given not only to collection but also to preservation. The handling reflected an understanding that even seemingly minor documents could carry technical or historical importance. Nothing was treated as disposable, and nothing was removed without being accounted for in some form of record, reinforcing the sense that the process was as much about safeguarding as it was about possession. From upper floors to service areas, the transfer followed a path designed for efficiency rather than visibility. The movement of trunks through the hotel avoided public-facing spaces, relying instead on service corridors and logistical routes that minimized attention. Elevators were used in repeated cycles, and loading points became temporary stations in a quiet but continuous operation. While the hotel itself remained open and active, this hidden flow of materials created a parallel sequence of movement that existed alongside everyday life without intersecting it in any obvious way. What emerged through this process was not a simple collection, but a volume that required coordination to manage. The removal was not completed in a single stage but unfolded gradually, with multiple transfers occurring as materials were prepared, checked, and relocated. Each trunk represented not just an object, but a segment of a larger intellectual archive, and the sheer number involved meant that no single point of handling could account for the entire scope at once. The scale of the operation became more apparent only in retrospect, once records were compiled and the full extent of the transfer could be understood. Lists were created to account for what had been taken, though these records could only describe the surface of what was inside. Inventories identified trunks, labelled documents, and noted categories of material, but they did not immediately explain their meaning or interconnection. A mathematical diagram and a written note might appear side by side in documentation, without any immediate clarity on how they related within Tesla's broader thinking. This gap between cataloguing and interpretation left much of the material in a state of organised uncertainty. Once removed, the materials did not remain in a single place, but were divided according to purpose and priority. Some were directed toward technical evaluation, where specialists could assess their scientific relevance, while others were placed in storage pending further review. This separation meant that Tesla's body of work, once physically unified in trunks, was now dispersed across different handling systems. The fragmentation introduced a new challenge. Understanding would now depend not only on what had been preserved, but on how it had been divided. Additional notes associated with the transfer indicate that not all materials were treated equally in terms of immediate review. Certain documents were flagged for closer inspection, particularly those that referenced advanced electrical systems or theoretical mechanisms that did not align neatly with established engineering knowledge at the time. While no public classification details were released, the selective attention given to specific materials suggests that some portions of Tesla's work were considered more sensitive or technically unusual than others. Control had been established, yet understanding remained incomplete, leaving much of the material defined only by its presence. The trunks had been removed, the documents accounted for, and the operation carried out with procedural precision, but the question of what had been gathered extended beyond inventory. Possession created access, but not comprehension, and the volume of material only deepened the gap between what was held and what was understood. Attention soon shifted from movement to examination, as specialists were brought in to assess what had been collected. the focus moved away from logistics and toward interpretation, marking the beginning of a slower and more uncertain phase. It was at this point that Tesla's stored work ceased to be simply an archive of personal records and became something that required structured analysis to even begin to interpret. The number of trunks, recorded and transported with such care, would remain one of the few concrete measures of what Tesla left behind. The Teleforce weapon documents. Not all materials attributed to Nikola Tesla consisted of physical objects that could be stored or transported. Among the trunks, notes, and technical papers collected after his death, there existed a separate category of content that could only exist on paper, defined not by form or mechanism, but by the scope of ideas it attempted to describe. These were not finished inventions in any practical sense, nor were they experimental records of confirmed results. Instead, they reflected structured attempts to outline systems that had never been realized in physical demonstration, yet were written with the precision of engineering thought rather than abstract speculation. In the context of the seized materials, this distinction became important because it meant that some of what was reviewed could not be understood through physical inspection alone. Among the written descriptions preserved in these documents was a concept Tesla referred to as Teleforce. The term itself appeared in his later public discussions and written explanations, where he attempted to describe a system based on the projection of concentrated energy over distance. It was not presented as a vague notion, but as a structured idea with defined components, intended to function as a defensive measure. In Tesla's framing, it was not designed for offensive use in the conventional sense, but rather as a deterrent system capable of preventing large-scale attack scenarios. The presence of this concept within the seized material placed it within a category of interest that extended beyond purely academic curiosity, because it touched on areas that intersected with defense-related research of the period. In his public statements during the early 1940s, Tesla described this proposed system as a form of defensive technology. He suggested that it could involve streams of particles accelerated to high velocities and directed with sufficient precision to create a protective effect at a distance. While these descriptions were presented in simplified form when addressed to the public or press, the underlying language in his private notes appeared more technical, incorporating references to high voltage generation, electrostatic principles, and particle dynamics. In some sections, the writing shifted between conceptual explanation and mathematical notation, suggesting that the idea was being developed in parallel at both descriptive and analytical levels, without a finalized structure that unified the two. The technical material combined references to high-voltage physics, particle behavior, and the projection of electromagnetic energy. These elements were not new individually within Tesla's broader body of work, as he had long studied alternating currents, resonance, and wireless energy transmission. However, in the context of these documents, they were arranged in ways that suggested an attempt to integrate them into a single functional system. Some portions appeared to explore how energy could be focused rather than dispersed, while others examined how charged particles might behave under controlled acceleration. The notes did not present a finalized blueprint, but rather a conceptual framework that moved across multiple fields of physics without settling into a completed engineering model. This made interpretation difficult, even for those familiar with his earlier inventions. Despite the detailed nature of the descriptions, there is no verified record that the system was ever constructed or tested. Unlike Tesla's earlier contributions to electrical engineering, which were demonstrated and replicated in practical settings, Teleforce remained confined to theoretical outlines and explanatory statements. This absence of physical verification is a key reason why the concept occupies an ambiguous position in historical analysis. It exists within documented material, yet without the accompanying experimental evidence typically required to confirm functionality. Even within the seized collection, there was no indication of a working prototype, only varying degrees of conceptual development. During a period defined by rapid advancements in military technology, any reference to long-range energy systems naturally attracted scrutiny. The early 1940s were marked by significant developments in radar, aviation, and weapon systems, creating an environment where theoretical proposals involving energy projection could not be dismissed without consideration. Even ideas that lacked practical demonstration were often reviewed for potential implications, particularly if they suggested new forms of defense or deterrence. In this context, Tesla's writings were not evaluated in isolation, but against a broader backdrop of technological acceleration that made even incomplete concepts worth examining. The documents themselves were not uniform, often appearing as fragmented notes, partial diagrams, and extended theoretical outlines. Some sections focused on mathematical relationships, while others contained descriptive passages outlining intended function, without providing complete procedural steps. Certain pages showed repeated revisions of similar ideas, as if Tesla was refining specific aspects without consolidating them into a single finalized system. This lack of structural consistency made it difficult to determine whether the material represented one evolving concept or multiple parallel lines of thought that were never fully separated. Even when examined by specialists, the material required careful analysis due to its lack of complete experimental validation. Technical interpretation depended not only on understanding the language used, but also on reconstructing intent from incomplete descriptions. Without physical demonstration or standardized documentation, conclusions could only be drawn from internal consistency and comparison with established principles of physics. In several cases, the challenge was not identifying what was written, but determining whether different sections were meant to describe the same mechanism or entirely separate theoretical explorations. This body of writing stood apart from conventional engineering records because it did not align with established practical implementations of the era. While Tesla's earlier work had directly contributed to systems that shaped modern electrical infrastructure, these later documents operated at a conceptual level that did not translate into immediate application. The separation between theoretical possibility and operational reality became increasingly pronounced within the material, reinforcing the difficulty of categorization. Even within technical review frameworks, the documents resisted simple classification as either speculative philosophy or executable design. As a result, the materials were forwarded for formal evaluation by experts capable of assessing their scientific relevance. This step marked the transition from collection to analysis, shifting the focus from what had been preserved to what could be understood through technical review. The responsibility for interpretation no longer rested with those who gathered the documents, but with those trained to examine whether any portion of the ideas could be grounded in physical law or practical design, even in principle. Additional internal summaries associated with the review process indicate that certain sections of the material received more focused attention than others, particularly those dealing with energy concentration and particle behavior. However, these summaries did not provide definitive conclusions, only noting areas that required further examination. This layered approach to assessment reinforced the sense that the documents were not being treated as a single invention, but as a collection of interrelated ideas that resisted immediate synthesis into one coherent system. The difficulty lay not in reading the documents, but in determining where recorded theory ended and unfinished intention began. John G. Trump's classified evaluation. Within the framework of wartime technical assessment, certain materials required formal scientific review rather than informal interpretation. By the early 1940s, the United States had developed institutional procedures for handling scientific documents that were considered unusual, incomplete, or potentially significant to national interests, especially when those materials came from figures whose work had already shaped modern engineering. In this context, the papers associated with Nikola Tesla were not simply archived or dismissed, but directed into a system designed to evaluate their technical substance with measured precision. The process itself reflected an effort to separate scientific possibility from speculation through structured examination, where conclusions depended on what could be verified rather than what could be imagined from partial information. At the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, engineer John G. Trump was assigned to evaluate a collection of materials connected to Nikola Tesla. Trump was already established in the field of electrical engineering and high-voltage research, with experience in radiation-related technologies, which made him a suitable candidate for reviewing complex and unconventional technical documents. His assignment did not involve public interpretation or historical analysis, but a focused technical review intended to determine whether the material contained principles that could be developed into functional systems or whether it remained purely theoretical in nature. The scope of his task was deliberately narrow, ensuring that the assessment remained within the boundaries of scientific feasibility. His role was defined strictly as a technical assessment, focused on determining whether the documents contained workable scientific principles. The evaluation was not intended to reconstruct Tesla's intent or to speculate on broader implications, but rather to examine whether the material adhered to known physical laws and whether any part of it could be translated into practical engineering design. This distinction shaped the entire review process, limiting it to measurable criteria rather than interpretive analysis. In practice, this meant that even unusual or highly abstract concepts had to be tested against established scientific frameworks before any judgment could be made. The papers he reviewed consisted of incomplete notes, fragmented diagrams, and theoretical descriptions lacking full experimental confirmation. Some sections contained mathematical expressions without accompanying explanations, while others presented conceptual outlines that suggested intended function without detailing implementation. In several instances, multiple ideas appeared within the same document without clear separation, making it difficult to determine whether they represented distinct systems or variations of a single evolving concept. There were also instances where diagrams appeared to reference earlier notes that were not present in the same set, creating gaps that complicated reconstruction of the overall structure. From a technical standpoint, the evaluation process required comparison against established principles of physics and engineering practice. This involved assessing whether the described systems could, in theory, operate within known physical constraints, and whether sufficient detail existed to support replication or further development. Without clear experimental validation, conclusions had to rely heavily on theoretical compatibility rather than empirical confirmation. In some cases, this meant identifying whether the underlying assumptions of a design were consistent with known scientific behavior, even if the design itself was not fully formed. Incomplete systems presented a particular challenge, as they could neither be fully validated nor definitively dismissed. When engineering documentation lacks key components such as experimental results, calibration data, or reproducible methodology, the boundary between conceptual exploration and executable design becomes difficult to define. In such cases, evaluation depends on inference rather than demonstration, which limits the ability to reach absolute conclusions. This structural limitation was especially relevant when dealing with material that appeared to evolve across multiple drafts without a finalized version. The conclusions drawn from the review were carefully worded, reflecting limited confirmation rather than absolute determination. Official summaries indicated that while the material contained advanced theoretical discussion, there was no evidence of a completed system or operational device within the reviewed documents. The language used in the findings remained deliberately restrained, emphasizing the absence of verifiable implementation rather than making broader judgments about potential or intent. This cautious phrasing reflected the standards of scientific reporting applied in formal evaluations, where uncertainty is documented rather than interpreted. No operational device or verified demonstration was identified within the material submitted for examination. While the documents contained references to complex energy concepts and theoretical mechanisms, none were accompanied by physical prototypes or experimental validation that would confirm functionality. This distinction was critical in separating theoretical discussion from applied engineering, as scientific confirmation typically requires reproducible evidence rather than conceptual description alone. Even when certain sections appear to describe system behavior in detail, the absence of supporting experimental records prevented classification as functional technology. The assessment remained confined to the documents themselves, without extending into assumptions about intent or theoretical extension. The evaluation process did not attempt to reconstruct what Tesla might have intended beyond what was explicitly recorded. Instead, it focused strictly on what could be verified within the material as presented. This limitation ensured that conclusions were based on observable content, rather than interpretive projection, maintaining the technical integrity of the review. It also meant that any broader implications of the ideas were left outside the scope of the formal analysis. Additional internal summaries associated with the review process suggest that certain portions of the material received more attention than others, particularly sections involving high-energy particle concepts and electromagnetic projection. However, these notes did not alter the overall conclusion of the evaluation, but rather highlighted areas that required careful interpretation due to their complexity. The presence of such emphasis indicates that while the material did not yield functional systems, it still contained elements that warranted detailed technical consideration during review. Following the review, the materials were categorized for storage and further administrative handling rather than immediate scientific development. This classification reflected the outcome of the evaluation process, where no actionable engineering system was confirmed, but the documents were still preserved due to their historical and potential technical interest. The categorization allowed for controlled retention, while acknowledging that immediate practical application had not been established, ensuring the materials remained accessible for future reference if needed. In later years, references to the evaluation appeared within broader historical discussions of Tesla's final body of work. These references often focused on the cautious and limited nature of the conclusions, particularly the absence of definitive findings regarding functionality or implementation. As Tesla's legacy continued to be examined through academic and public interest, the review conducted by John G. Trump remained one of the few structured scientific assessments directly associated with his unpublished materials, often cited for its restrained and methodical approach. Even under structured scientific review, the boundary between incomplete theory and unverified possibility remained unresolved. Technical diagrams with no known application. Among the materials recovered from Nikola Tesla's belongings were numerous technical drawings that stood apart from written descriptions. They were not presented as finished reports or formal documentation, but as visual constructions that appeared to capture systems in an intermediate stage of thought. In contrast to the more structured manuscripts and notes, these pages relied almost entirely on form, line, and spatial arrangement to communicate meaning. For those examining the collection, they represented a different kind of challenge, because they required interpretation not only of language, but of visual intent without accompanying explanation. Even the paper itself showed variation in quality and format, suggesting the diagrams were produced across different periods rather than as part of a single organized compilation. Some of the most detailed pages contained schematic representations resembling electrical and mechanical systems. Wires, coils, geometric structures, and layered components appeared in various combinations across the drawings, suggesting attempts to map relationships between energy, motion, or force. While some elements echoed familiar engineering concepts from the early 20th century, others did not align cleanly with any established system. The absence of consistent labeling made it difficult to determine whether these diagrams were intended as complete designs or partial studies of broader ideas. In several cases, similar visual motifs appeared repeatedly, as if certain configurations were being revisited without ever being finalized. In many cases, the structures depicted in these diagrams did not correspond to any known engineering systems of the period. Electrical engineering at the time had well-established conventions for representing circuits, machines, and power systems, yet certain configurations in these sketches did not follow those conventions in a recognizable way. Instead of standardized symbols or clearly defined pathways, some drawings used abstract spatial relationships that did not immediately translate into functional interpretation. This created a gap between visual structure and functional identification, where the presence of order did not necessarily translate into understood purpose. The diagrams could be observed, but not immediately categorized within existing technical frameworks, even by those familiar with Tesla's earlier work. Several of the drawings lacked clear labeling or explanatory notes that would normally define their function. Where annotations did appear, they were often brief, symbolic, or incomplete, offering limited guidance on how the depicted components were intended to operate together. In standard engineering documentation, diagrams are typically supported by legends, equations, or procedural explanations, but in these materials that supporting structure was frequently absent. This absence left the visual information isolated, requiring interpretation without the usual anchors that define technical meaning. In some instances, arrows and directional marks were present, but without consistent reference points, their significance remained uncertain. Unlike Tesla's earlier published inventions, these sketches followed a less standardized and more fragmented visual structure. His documented contributions to electrical engineering had historically been accompanied by clear conceptual frameworks, particularly in areas such as alternating current systems and wireless transmission experiments. In contrast, these later diagrams did not consistently reflect a unified drafting style or an established system of notation. The variation in presentation suggested that they may have been produced at different times or under different working conditions, without consolidation into a finalized format, Some sheets appeared carefully drafted, while others looked more like working drafts, reinforcing the sense of ongoing but unfinished exploration. For those trained in engineering analysis, the absence of familiar reference points made interpretation significantly more challenging. Technical evaluation typically depends on identifying known patterns, comparing systems to established models, and verifying functional logic through recognizable principles. In this case, however, the diagrams resisted such comparison. Even when individual components appeared familiar, their arrangement often did not conform to expected configurations, making it difficult to determine intended operation without speculation. This difficulty was not due to lack of complexity, but due to the absence of a shared structural language that could immediately situate the drawings within known engineering practice. Some sections of the material appeared to suggest functional intent, though the exact purpose remained undocumented. Certain arrangements of components implied movement of energy or interaction between electrical elements, but without accompanying explanation, these impressions remained tentative. In engineering documentation, intent is usually supported by descriptive text or experimental data, neither of which was consistently present alongside these drawings. As a result, any interpretation of function remained conditional on assumption rather than confirmation. Even repeated patterns across different pages did not resolve into a clearly defined operational model. The diagrams were not consistently grouped, often appearing across separate pages without clear sequence or connection. This fragmentation made it difficult to establish whether they were part of a larger system or independent studies exploring different ideas. In some cases, similar shapes or structures appeared in multiple drawings, but without enough contextual information to determine whether they represented iterations of the same concept or entirely separate designs. The lack of continuity introduced additional uncertainty into their interpretation, as chronological or conceptual ordering could not be reliably established from the material itself. Attempts to categorize the drawings within conventional engineering fields did not produce a definitive classification. Some elements suggested electrical systems, others hinted at mechanical assemblies, and a few appeared abstract enough to resist direct comparison altogether. This overlap without resolution created a situation where multiple interpretations were technically possible, but none could be confirmed with certainty. The diagrams existed in a space between established disciplines without settling into a clearly defined category. Even attempts to group them by visual similarity did not yield consistent results, as recurring motifs appeared in unrelated contexts. Additional internal notes associated with the broader collection indicate that certain diagrams were reviewed alongside written material, though not always directly linked to specific explanatory texts. This separation between visual and written components further complicated efforts to reconstruct intent, as some sketches may have been intended to complement descriptions that were not physically attached. Without clear pairing, the relationship between image and explanation remained speculative, even when thematic similarities were present. No confirmed working system has been directly linked to the configurations shown in these technical illustrations. While Tesla's broader body of work includes numerous verified inventions and practical contributions, these specific drawings have not been associated with any demonstrated operational device. Their relationship to functional engineering remains unverified, leaving them as standalone visual records without confirmed application. This separation between depiction and demonstration is central to their continued ambiguity, as structure alone does not establish function. In later academic discussions, these diagrams were occasionally referenced as examples of incomplete technical visualization. Researchers examining Tesla's archival material have noted that while the drawings demonstrate complexity and structural intent, they do not consistently provide enough information to establish practical implementation. As a result, they are often treated as conceptual artifacts rather than executable designs, reflecting a stage of thought that was never fully resolved into applied engineering. Their value in historical study lies less in confirmed outcome and more in the challenge they present to classification itself. The presence of structure without recognizable function left the material defined more by form than by any confirmed purpose. Pages missing from the official inventory. Administrative systems used during the cataloguing of seized scientific materials relied on structured inventories designed to record each item with formal consistency. These systems were not unique to any single case, but reflected standard procedures used when large volumes of documents and physical objects were transferred under governmental authority. Each entry was intended to provide a traceable link between what was physically collected and what was formally documented, ensuring that the chain of custody remained intact from removal to storage. In principle, such systems were designed to eliminate uncertainty, yet their effectiveness depended entirely on the accuracy and completeness of the initial recording process, which in practice could vary depending on conditions on the ground and the number of hands involved in the documentation. Across these records, individual entries were compiled to account for the materials recovered from Nikola Tesla's possessions. The documentation included references to trunks, papers, and technical materials that had been transferred under controlled conditions following his death. Each listed item was assigned a position within the broader inventory structure, creating an organized framework intended to reflect the full scope of what had been collected. In theory, this framework should have produced a complete mirror of the physical transfer, allowing any item to be traced through reference numbers, descriptive labels, and storage assignments. However, the structure of these records also meant that their accuracy was only as strong as the consistency between separate documentation sources compiled at different stages of the process, often under changing administrative oversight. In reviewing the surviving documentation, inconsistencies begin to appear between listed entries and the physical scope of what was reportedly collected. Some references suggest the existence of materials that do not appear in the final consolidated listings, while other entries are present without clear physical correspondence in later summaries. These discrepancies do not immediately indicate loss or removal, but they do introduce uncertainty into the relationship between recorded data and physical evidence. What becomes significant is not a single missing entry, but the pattern in which certain references appear to exist in one version of the record and disappear in another, without any explicit notation explaining their removal or reclassification. Inventory procedures of this type typically rely on sequential logging, categorical separation, and cross-reference documentation to ensure completeness. Each item is generally assigned a unique identifier, allowing it to be tracked across multiple stages of handling and storage. When this process functions as intended, every physical object can be matched to a corresponding record, creating a closed system of verification. In more complex operations, additional layers of indexing are introduced, including duplicate logs and secondary summaries intended to prevent loss during transfer between departments. However, the reliability of such systems depends heavily on uninterrupted continuity between initial cataloging and final archival consolidation, which is not always guaranteed in large-scale operations involving multiple administrative transitions. When multiple versions of these records are compared, certain references do not align consistently across all surviving lists. In some instances, an item appears in early documentation but is absent from later summaries, while in other cases, later records include entries that do not clearly originate in earlier inventories. This lack of consistent alignment does not necessarily imply deliberate alteration, but it does indicate that the documentation process was not entirely uniform. Even minor differences in phrasing or categorization can result in the same item being recorded in ways that are not immediately recognizable as identical across different documents. Over time, these small variations accumulate into structural gaps that become more visible when the records are studied as a whole rather than in isolation. Some entries appear to reference materials that are not clearly accounted for in the final compiled documentation. These references may include general descriptions, partial identifiers, or abbreviated notes that do not match any single item in the surviving physical catalogue. In archival practice, such entries are sometimes used as temporary placeholders when full classification has not yet been completed. However, when no corresponding update appears in later revisions, these placeholders remain in the historical record without resolution. Without consistent labelling or supporting context, such entries remain difficult to resolve into identifiable objects or documents, existing instead as incomplete markers within the administrative structure. Standard record-keeping limitations, including transcription errors or parallel documentation systems, offer one possible explanation for these discrepancies. In large administrative environments, it is not uncommon for multiple versions of records to be created simultaneously, particularly when materials are being processed under time constraints. Differences between preliminary logs, working drafts, and final summaries can emerge as information is consolidated, reviewed, and reorganized. In some cases, separate teams may maintain overlapping records that are later merged into a single archive, a process that can introduce subtle inconsistencies in naming conventions, ordering, or classification hierarchy. These procedural factors can introduce variations that appear as gaps when later examined in isolation from their original context. The process of merging multiple documentation streams can often result in uneven alignment between original and consolidated records. When data is collected at different stages by different personnel or departments, subtle inconsistencies in labeling, categorization, or sequencing can accumulate. Over time, these small differences may produce larger structural mismatches in the final archival record. Such outcomes are not uncommon in complex documentation systems, especially when the volume of material requires continuous updating and verification. In some archival environments, reconciliation of conflicting entries is deferred until later review stages, and not all discrepancies are necessarily resolved within the final published inventory. During large-scale governmental handling of materials, administrative pressure frequently impacted the precision of record consolidation. The necessity of processing extensive collections within limited timeframes often meant that documentation had to prioritize operational efficiency over absolute uniformity. In such conditions, minor discrepancies could persist through multiple stages of review without immediate correction. Once transferred into permanent storage systems, these inconsistencies could become embedded in the archival structure, preserved not as errors to be corrected, but as part of the historical record itself. This means that some gaps may reflect procedural realities rather than physical absence. Even within finalized inventories, certain references remain without clear correspondence in the surviving material sets. These unresolved entries do not necessarily indicate missing objects, but rather a lack of definitive linkage between recorded descriptions and physical items. In archival terms, such cases are typically marked for unresolved status, pending further clarification or cross-referencing. However, when no additional documentation emerges, these entries remain permanently unverified within the historical record. Over time, they become part of a static archive of uncertainty, preserved without resolution due to lack of supplementary evidence. Later examinations of these records noted the presence of structural gaps that could not be immediately reconciled through standard archival comparison. Researchers reviewing the material in subsequent years observed that while the overall framework of the inventory appeared intact, certain internal inconsistencies persisted across different versions of the documentation. These observations did not lead to definitive conclusions, but they did highlight the inherent limitations of reconstructing complete historical records from fragmented administrative sources. The absence of full continuity between versions became, in itself, a documented feature of the archive. What the records failed to reconcile remained embedded in their structure rather than in their content. Evidence of an undisclosed worksite. Public records of Nikola Tesla's scientific work primarily identify a limited number of known experimental and engineering locations. These include his well-documented laboratories in New York and Colorado Springs, as well as Wardenclyffe, which is frequently cited in relation to his large-scale transmission concepts. Within these environments, Tesla's work is generally understood to have taken place under observable and historically recorded conditions, with surviving documentation linking experiments to identifiable physical sites. This established framework creates a baseline assumption that his research activity can be mapped through known addresses and facilities, forming a structured geographic outline of his scientific career. However, within the archived materials attributed to Tesla's later years, there are references that do not always align cleanly with this geographic structure. Certain technical notes describe experimental conditions in detail, without consistently identifying a fixed or named location. Instead of referencing a specific laboratory or installation, these entries focus on environmental or operational parameters, such as setup behavior, electrical conditions, or system response characteristics. This creates a subtle gap between what is described experimentally and where those descriptions can be confidently placed, leaving parts of the record open to interpretation rather than direct confirmation. Some materials extend this ambiguity by presenting experimental sequences without clear spatial anchoring. In these cases, the focus remains on electrical or mechanical behavior, while the physical setting is either absent or only indirectly implied through context. The absence of explicit location identifiers does not necessarily indicate the existence of undisclosed facilities, but it does introduce uncertainty when attempting to correlate experiments with known Tesla sites. As a result, certain entries remain technically descriptive without being geographically definitive, existing more as functional records than fully contextualized reports. Wardenclyffe often serves as the primary reference point when interpreting Tesla's large-scale electrical work, particularly in relation to wireless transmission concepts. It is the most extensively documented of his later experimental environments and provides a physical context for many of his theoretical ideas. However, not all references found in later materials can be directly or confidently associated with Wardenclyffe itself. Some descriptions appear to operate at a conceptual level that does not explicitly tie them to its infrastructure or documented experimental setup, suggesting that certain ideas may have been developed independently of any single recorded site. In several cases, experimental descriptions appear detached from any identifiable laboratory framework. These entries focus on system behavior, electrical interaction, or measurement outcomes, but do not consistently include supporting details such as apparatus layout, facility structure, or environmental conditions. This separation between conceptual description and physical context creates interpretive limitations, as it becomes difficult to determine whether these notes refer to controlled laboratory experiments, theoretical modelling, or preliminary conceptual planning. The scientific content remains clear, while the spatial grounding becomes less certain. One possible explanation is that some experiments were recorded in a manner that prioritized scientific behavior over physical documentation. In this interpretation, the absence of location detail may reflect the way notes were taken, rather than the existence of additional research sites. Scientific documentation from the period often varied in structure, with some entries emphasizing results, calculations, or system responses, rather than environmental specificity. This makes it difficult to distinguish between incomplete recording practices and genuinely missing contextual information, especially when multiple document types exist side by side. At the same time, the possibility of experimental mobility cannot be fully dismissed from a documentation standpoint. Certain notes imply conditions that could theoretically be reproduced outside of permanent laboratory environments, particularly in work involving electrical fields, high-voltage discharge systems, and portable apparatus configurations. However, there is no surviving record that confirms the establishment of additional fixed facilities beyond those already documented in Tesla's known biography. The archival record remains silent on any officially recognized secondary research sites, leaving only indirect references without structural confirmation. What complicates interpretation further is the presence of fragmented environmental descriptions that do not match standard laboratory frameworks. These descriptions occasionally reference operational conditions without specifying structural surroundings, architectural details, or consistent spatial markers. In some instances, even the sequencing of experiments suggests continuity, yet the physical setting remains undefined. While such fragments may simply reflect abbreviated technical writing or lost context, they also prevent definitive alignment with known physical locations, limiting the precision of reconstruction efforts. Additional complexity arises from inconsistencies in how observational context was recorded across different sets of notes. Some documents are highly structured, while others are condensed into near-abstract technical summaries. This variation suggests that Tesla's recording methods may have shifted depending on the purpose of the experiment or the stage of development being documented. As a result, spatial clarity is unevenly distributed throughout the material, with certain sections offering detailed experimental environments and others omitting them entirely. Modern analysis of these materials is further constrained by incomplete metadata. Many recovered documents exist without accompanying explanatory frameworks that would clarify when, where, or under what conditions certain experiments were conducted. This absence of structured contextual information is not unusual in historical scientific archives, but it becomes more significant when attempting to map experimental activity to specific sites or reconstruct full laboratory workflows. As a result, interpretation relies heavily on indirect inference, rather than direct documentation, increasing the degree of uncertainty in spatial attribution. Across the surviving material, there is a recurring separation between conceptual experimentation and physical site identification. Many entries are technically detailed in terms of electrical behavior, system configuration, or theoretical outcomes, yet remain silent on where those observations were recorded. This creates a consistent pattern in which scientific intent is visible, but geographical certainty is not always present. The result is a layered archive in which ideas are preserved more completely than their physical contexts. No complete record exists that definitively confirms additional permanent Tesla research facilities beyond those already documented in historical sources. While gaps and ambiguities exist within the archival material, they do not constitute direct evidence of undisclosed laboratory infrastructure. Instead, they reflect the limitations of surviving documentation, the variability of scientific record-keeping practices, and the uneven preservation of contextual detail across Tesla's scientific output. The materials therefore suggest uncertainty in placement, not certainty in expansion. The result is a body of material in which experimental activity is clearly present, but not always fully anchored to a verifiable physical environment, leaving interpretation dependent on what is preserved, rather than what may have once been fully documented. Unfinished plans for wireless global power. A recurring pattern in Nikola Tesla's later technical material points toward large-scale energy transmission concepts that extend beyond conventional electrical systems. These references do not appear as a single cohesive proposal, but instead surface repeatedly across different notes, sketches, and technical discussions, suggesting that the idea persisted over time in evolving forms. Rather than being confined to one document or phase of work, the concept seems to reappear in different contexts, each time expressed with variations in detail, scale, and emphasis. This repetition across fragmented material creates the impression of an idea that was continually revisited, though never fully consolidated into a final unified system. Proposals contained in these documents describe methods of transferring electrical energy without reliance on continuous wired infrastructure. The underlying principle, as expressed in the surviving material, involves the distribution of power through means that do not depend on traditional conductive networks, which were the dominant standard of electrical delivery at the time. While the language used in these references varies, the central theme remains consistent: the exploration of energy movement through alternative transmission pathways. However, the document stops short of presenting a fully defined operational method, leaving the concept at a theoretical or partially developed stage. Some of these ideas are associated with experimental work conducted at the facility, commonly linked to Wardenclyffe. This site is historically recognized as part of Tesla's efforts to investigate wireless transmission systems on a larger scale, and it is frequently referenced in connection with his broader ambitions in global energy distribution. Surviving records suggest that certain structural and experimental components were constructed there, but the extent to which these align with the more expansive theoretical descriptions remains unclear. The connection between physical infrastructure and conceptual design is therefore present, but not fully resolved within the documented evidence. The supporting material does not exist as a unified document, but rather as dispersed notes, diagrams, and partial calculations. These fragments appear across different sections of Tesla's recorded work, often without explicit links that would indicate a single continuous system. Some pages focus on mathematical relationships, while others outline conceptual structures or energy behavior in abstract terms. This fragmentation makes it difficult to determine whether the materials represent stages of a single design process or separate explorations of related ideas. The lack of consolidation leaves the system implied, but never formally assembled in one place. The scale implied in these proposals suggests systems intended for energy distribution across exceptionally large distances. Rather than localized transmission, the concepts described in the material point toward a form of energy dissemination that could operate across regional or even global ranges. This scale of ambition placed the ideas beyond the practical electrical infrastructure of the early 20th century, which was still primarily focused on localized generation and distribution networks. As a result, the proposals exist in a space between theoretical expansion and the technological limitations of their time. No single surviving document presents a fully integrated or finalized blueprint of the entire proposed system. While multiple references point toward interconnected components, there is no complete schematic that unifies these elements into a single operational design. This absence is significant, as it prevents a definitive reconstruction of how the system was intended to function as a whole. Instead, researchers are left with partial representations that suggest structure without confirming completion, leaving the overall design perpetually incomplete in the archival record. Among the surviving materials are isolated diagrams and equations that appear to relate to different components of a broader concept. These include mathematical expressions that suggest relationships between energy, distance, and transmission behavior, as well as schematic sketches that imply structural arrangements of equipment. However, these elements are not consistently linked to one another in a way that would confirm a single unified framework. Each fragment provides partial insight, but none offers full operational clarity when viewed in isolation. The theoretical foundation of these ideas places them at the boundary between emerging electrical theory and early 20th century engineering capability. At the time, scientific understanding of electromagnetism was advancing rapidly, yet many proposed applications still face significant practical and experimental limitations. The concepts described in Tesla's materials extend into areas that were still being actively explored, making it difficult to determine where theoretical exploration ends and engineering implementation begins. This overlap contributes to the ongoing ambiguity surrounding the feasibility of the system as described. The Wardenclyffe project is frequently referenced in connection with attempts to test elements of these broader transmission concepts. Historical accounts indicate that this facility was intended to serve as an experimental site for investigating large-scale wireless energy transmission, though the full scope of its intended function remains a subject of interpretation. Surviving documentation suggests that construction and experimentation occurred there, but the relationship between the physical infrastructure and the broader theoretical system is not fully documented in surviving records. This leaves the project partially defined within the historical record. Related references are distributed across separate pages and documents, rather than consolidated into a single coherent system description. This dispersion of material means that understanding the concept requires assembling information from multiple sources, each containing only partial aspects of the overall idea. In some cases, related notes appear in different formats or contexts, further complicating efforts to establish direct connections between them. The result is a body of work that suggests continuity, but does not provide a continuous narrative of development. Subsequent technical analyses often attempt to reconstruct the intended system by aligning fragmented references across multiple archival sources. Researchers reviewing Tesla's materials have noted recurring themes and structural similarities that suggest an underlying conceptual framework, even in the absence of a complete blueprint. These reconstructions remain interpretive, however, as they depend on connecting incomplete data points, rather than examining a finalized design. The process highlights both the richness and the fragmentation of the surviving material. The concept is recognizable in fragments, yet never fully assembled in any surviving record. Reports of unexplained signal reception. Scattered throughout Nikola Tesla's later technical material are repeated references to irregular signal observations recorded during experimental work. These entries do not appear as part of a single organized study, but instead emerge intermittently across different notes and technical discussions. In several cases, they are positioned alongside unrelated electrical experiments, suggesting that they were recorded as part of broader observational work rather than isolated investigations. The consistency lies not in their placement, but in the recurring description of signal behavior that did not immediately align with expected sources. Even in fragments where the surrounding subject matter shifts, the signal remarks remain technically phrased, as though intended for later review, rather than immediate interpretation. Initial developments in wireless communication relied on rapidly evolving methods of signal detection and interpretation. At the time, researchers were still refining the distinction between intentional transmissions and naturally occurring electrical disturbances, making signal analysis a developing discipline rather than a fully standardized field. Instruments used for detection were sensitive to a wide range of environmental and technical variables, and interpretation often required careful calibration. Within this evolving scientific landscape, unusual readings were not uncommon, though their classification depended heavily on context and repeatability. The scientific environment of the period therefore contained a high tolerance for ambiguity, especially in experimental settings where signal behavior was still being mapped empirically. Certain entries describe signal behavior that did not align with expected transmission sources or known emitters. These descriptions do not present themselves as confirmed external communications, but rather as observed irregularities in reception patterns. The notes focus on characteristics such as timing, intensity variation, and inconsistency in repetition, without assigning them to specific origins. In some instances, the wording suggests repeated observation under similar experimental conditions, though without accompanying procedural detail that would allow those conditions to be precisely reconstructed. As a result, the entries remain descriptive in nature, documenting what was observed without extending into verified explanation or classification. These descriptions appear in observational form, without accompanying experimental conclusions or formal classification. In most cases, they are recorded as brief remarks within broader technical notes, rather than developed into structured experimental reports. There is no indication of systematic follow-up within the surviving material, which suggests that the observations remained at an early stage of documentation. This format reinforces their status as recorded events rather than completed analyses, preserving the initial observation without progression into defined theoretical interpretation. Even when similar phrasing is used across different entries, no unified methodology is attached to them. Comparable signal patterns are documented in multiple sections of unrelated technical notes. While the entries are not grouped together in any formal section, their similarity in phrasing and description suggests repeated encounters with similar phenomena or conditions. This repetition across separate documents introduces continuity at the level of observation, even though no unified study or explanatory framework accompanies them. The recurrence itself becomes a notable feature, indicating that the observations were not entirely isolated incidents within the broader body of material. However, the absence of structured linkage between entries prevents any confirmation that they form part of a single experimental sequence. No consistent identification of origin accompanies these recorded signal events. The notes do not attribute the signals to known transmission sources, experimental equipment, or environmental phenomena in a definitive manner. In technical documentation, source attribution is typically essential for classification, yet in these entries such attribution is either absent or left unresolved. In some cases, contextual references nearby suggest concurrent experiments involving wireless reception equipment, but no explicit connection is drawn between those setups and the recorded anomalies. This separation preserves uncertainty within the record, leaving origin unassigned despite repeated observation. Documentation consistently separates the act of detecting a signal from any explanation of its cause. The entries emphasize measurement and observation rather than interpretation, reflecting a methodological distinction common in experimental recording. This separation ensures that raw observational data is preserved independently of theoretical assumptions. However, it also means that without additional context, the observed phenomena remain disconnected from explanatory frameworks that would normally define their scientific significance. In several instances, the surrounding notes transition to unrelated electrical topics immediately after the signal remarks, reinforcing their isolation within the broader material. At the time, irregular reception could often be attributed to atmospheric conditions or technical interference. Early radio environments were subject to a wide range of external influences, including weather-related electrical activity, equipment sensitivity variations, and overlapping transmissions. These factors were frequently considered when evaluating unexpected signal behavior, and many anomalies were later explained through improved understanding of environmental interference. Within this context, unusual readings were not necessarily treated as extraordinary, but as part of a developing field still establishing its methodological boundaries. Even strong or repeating signals did not automatically imply a unique source without corroborating technical evidence. No structured research sequence appears to have been dedicated solely to these signal observations. The surviving material does not indicate the formation of a continuous experimental program focused exclusively on investigating these events. Instead, the references appear embedded within broader technical work, suggesting that they were noted incidentally rather than pursued as a central line of inquiry. In some cases, marginal annotations indicate brief revisits to earlier observations, but without expansion into formal analysis or documented experimental repetition. This lack of continuity limits the ability to trace development or determine whether the observations were ever intended to form a distinct research direction. References to these signals are distributed across various documents, rather than centralized in a unified report. This fragmentation means that each instance must be interpreted within its immediate context, without the benefit of a consolidated framework. As a result, relationships between individual observations are not explicitly defined within the archival structure. Some entries appear in proximity to discussions of atmospheric electricity or wireless transmission experiments, while others are embedded in unrelated technical calculations, further complicating attempts to establish thematic grouping. The dispersion of material complicates efforts to reconstruct a continuous narrative, leaving only isolated points of reference across the surviving documentation. Modern review of the material remains constrained by missing experimental context and incomplete documentation chains. Without supporting data such as calibration records, environmental measurements, or synchronized observational logs, it is difficult to fully reconstruct the conditions under which these signals were recorded. This limitation is a common challenge in historical scientific analysis, where partial preservation of records can restrict interpretive certainty. In such cases, conclusions must remain grounded in what is explicitly documented rather than inferred from incomplete evidence. The absence of supporting structure therefore becomes as significant as the observations themselves in assessing historical clarity. The recorded patterns persist in the archive even where their origin is never fully established. Advanced magnetic field experiments beyond a sea power. Rotating magnetic field theory, central to Nikola Tesla's alternating current work, formed one of the most influential foundations of modern electrical engineering. It provided the principle by which electrical energy could be converted into controlled mechanical motion through the interaction of synchronized magnetic fields. This concept became the basis for a wide range of practical systems that defined early electrical infrastructure, particularly in motor and power distribution design. In its established form, the theory was already well understood as a stable engineering solution, with predictable behavior under controlled conditions. What makes the later references notable is not the principle itself, but the suggestion that its behavior was still being examined under conditions that went beyond standard industrial application. Early alternating current systems demonstrated how rotating fields could be harnessed for practical mechanical power generation and transmission. These systems translated electromagnetic principles into repeatable industrial applications, allowing energy to be distributed efficiently across distances and converted into usable mechanical output. The success of these implementations marked a significant transition from theoretical physics to applied electrical engineering. Within this framework, rotating magnetic fields were not abstract concepts, but functional mechanisms embedded in industrial design. This established baseline is important because the later material does not reject these applications, but appears to revisit the same principle from a more fundamental and less application-bound perspective. Certain technical references suggest that this principle was examined beyond its conventional application in motor and transformer design. These references do not indicate a departure from known physics, but rather an extension of interest into how magnetic fields behave under varying conditions and configurations. The language used in these materials remains technical and observational, focusing on field interaction rather than finished machinery. In some cases, the descriptions are incomplete, as though they represent partial considerations within a larger line of inquiry that was never fully consolidated into a single documented system. This leaves the material positioned between established engineering and unfinished theoretical extension. Attention in some notes appears to move away from machinery and toward the underlying behavior of magnetic fields themselves. Instead of focusing on devices that utilize rotating fields, the emphasis shifts toward the conditions that produce, sustain, and modify those fields. This conceptual transition reflects an analytical approach where the physical phenomenon becomes the primary subject of examination. While the intent of these notes is not explicitly defined, the shift in focus suggests an interest in the foundational dynamics of electromagnetic behavior rather than its immediate mechanical output. In this form, the field is treated less as a tool and more as a system of behavior under varying conditions. Surviving material includes partial descriptions of configurations that do not form a complete or continuous experimental record. These fragments appear as isolated references to arrangements of coils, conductive elements, or field-generating conditions, but without sufficient continuity to reconstruct a full experimental sequence. In some cases, these descriptions are embedded within broader technical discussions, making it difficult to determine whether they represent experimental planning, theoretical exploration, or observational notes recorded during ongoing work. The absence of sequential structure suggests that these entries were never organized into a finalized experimental framework. No fully preserved documentation outlines a finalized or fully assembled experimental setup beyond established AC system designs. While Tesla's contributions to alternating current technology are well documented in their practical forms, there is no surviving comprehensive blueprint that confirms extended experimental apparatus built specifically for advanced field manipulation beyond known applications. This absence is significant because it separates documented engineering achievement from unverified or partially recorded conceptual exploration. Even where later references imply expansion of the same principle, the archival record does not preserve a complete implementation pathway that would confirm physical realization. Some references imply consideration of magnetic field behavior under conditions that extend beyond standard engineering scales. These considerations appear in the form of theoretical discussion rather than practical implementation, focusing on how field intensity, distribution, or interaction might behave under expanded parameters. In certain instances, the description suggests comparative reasoning, as though different configurations were being evaluated for stability or responsiveness under altered conditions. The material does not confirm physical testing at these scales, but it does indicate that such conditions were part of conceptual analysis rather than purely abstract speculation. There is no direct evidence linking these extended considerations to implemented industrial systems or operational technology. While the foundational rotating field principle clearly influenced practical electrical engineering, the more advanced or expanded references remain disconnected from verified applications. This separation reinforces the distinction between established technological contributions and exploratory theoretical work. As a result, these ideas exist in the archival record as extensions of thought rather than confirmed engineering outcomes, preserved in fragmentary form without clear transition into application. The conceptual basis remains anchored in the same rotating field principles that underpin Tesla's documented contributions to AC motor development. This continuity is important, as it ensures that even extended references remain grounded in verified physical theory. The underlying electromagnetic framework does not change, even when the focus shifts toward broader or less defined conditions. What changes instead is the level of abstraction, where the field itself becomes the object of extended consideration, rather than only a component within mechanical systems. Isolated expressions and partial calculations appear without accompanying derivations that would establish a complete theoretical framework. These fragments suggest engagement with quantitative analysis, but they do not form a continuous mathematical system. In several instances, numerical relationships are presented without clear indication of initial assumptions or boundary conditions, leaving their interpretive scope open-ended. Without full derivations or supporting experimental context, the purpose of these calculations remains partially defined, existing as components of a broader intellectual process that is not fully preserved in the surviving documentation. Modern analysis of these references is limited by the absence of continuous experimental documentation or standardized recording structure. Without complete datasets or sequential records, it is not possible to fully reconstruct the progression of ideas or determine how individual fragments relate to one another in practice. This limitation is common in historical technical archives, where preservation often captures results or notes without the full procedural context that produced them. As a result, interpretation relies on partial continuity rather than complete reconstruction of experimental intent. The recorded ideas suggest extension, yet the full trajectory of their development remains incomplete within the surviving record. The high-frequency oscillator schematics. High-frequency electrical systems in Nikola Tesla's technical work are frequently associated with attempts to explore behavior beyond standard alternating current conditions. These systems operate in a domain where conventional assumptions about steady operation begin to shift, particularly when oscillation rates increase and circuit response becomes less linear. In this context, high-frequency work is not treated as a separate discipline, but as an extension of existing electrical principles pushed into more sensitive and less stable operating ranges. The surviving references do not present these systems as finished inventions, but as evolving configurations under continuous adjustment, often recorded in ways that suggest incremental refinement rather than fixed design completion. Resonant electrical systems were widely used in early experimentation to study amplification, stability, and energy transfer under controlled conditions. In basic form, resonance allows electrical systems to respond strongly at specific frequencies, making it a valuable tool for both measurement and signal enhancement. Tesla's documented engagement with resonance is well established within standard electrical theory, particularly in relation to coils and tuned circuits. However, some references suggest continued exploration of how these resonant effects behave when driven beyond typical operational constraints, where system response becomes increasingly complex and less predictable. This includes situations where expected damping behavior appears altered under experimental conditions described only in partial notes. Certain schematic references indicate configurations intended to operate at significantly elevated oscillation rates compared to conventional designs. These descriptions do not present a complete engineering system, but rather partial arrangements of components that imply an interest in extreme frequency behavior. The documentation does not always specify intended outcomes, leaving interpretation focused on structural arrangement rather than functional purpose. In some cases, these configurations appear to prioritize the relationship between components over the definition of a stable output, suggesting experimentation centered on behavior rather than application. The absence of clear endpoints in these designs reinforces their classification as exploratory rather than finalized engineering systems. Some descriptions suggest that instability was not avoided entirely, but examined as a measurable characteristic of system behavior. In electrical systems, instability typically represents deviation from steady oscillation, often leading to fluctuations in amplitude or frequency. Within the context of experimental design, however, such behavior can also be studied as part of system limits and response thresholds. The presence of instability-related references indicates attention to how circuits behave when operating near or beyond stable conditions, though without clear indication of how these observations were intended to be applied. In several notes, instability appears alongside frequency adjustments, implying controlled variation rather than accidental disruption. Surviving material includes incomplete circuit arrangements that do not form a continuous or fully connected design. These fragments often show partial pathways between components, such as inductive elements, capacitive structures, or conductive connections, but lack full integration into a single functioning schematic. As a result, the material reads more like sections of a larger conceptual framework rather than finalized engineering documentation. The absence of continuity prevents full reconstruction of system intent, leaving only isolated structural references within the archive. Even where component relationships are identifiable, their sequencing and operational dependency remain undocumented. No complete and independently verified oscillator system matching these advanced configurations is preserved in the existing record. While high-frequency oscillation is a well-documented area of electrical engineering, the specific schematic references in question do not correspond to any confirmed operational device. This distinction is important, as it separates established technological development from incomplete or partially documented design exploration. The archival record therefore supports the existence of conceptual work, but not a fully validated implementation of the reference configurations. This gap between design intent and preserved execution remains consistent across multiple fragments in the material. References to shifting or expanded frequency ranges appear in isolated notes without accompanying system-level integration. These mentions suggest consideration of how circuit behavior changes across different oscillation scales, but they are not consistently linked to a unified experimental procedure. Without full contextual documentation, it is not possible to determine whether these references represent theoretical exploration, preliminary testing, or conceptual modeling. They remain technical observations without full integration into a structured experimental framework, often appearing adjacent to unrelated electrical calculations or coil-related discussions. These concepts remain grounded in established principles of resonance and oscillatory behavior in electrical circuits. The underlying physics does not depart from known electrical theory, particularly in the relationship between frequency, inductance, and capacitance in resonant systems. Instead, the material reflects an exploration of how these principles behave under extended or intensified conditions. This continuity with known science is significant, as it indicates extension rather than deviation from established electrical understanding. The complexity arises not from new physics, but from pushing familiar principles into less stable operational regimes. There is no documented evidence linking these schematic references to finalized or deployed electrical devices. While Tesla's broader contributions to electrical engineering are well established in practical applications, These specific oscillator-related configurations do not appear in verified operational systems. The absence of application mapping reinforces the distinction between experimental design exploration and implemented technology. As a result, these schematics remain within the domain of technical study rather than confirmed engineering output, existing as design investigations without confirmed material realization. Isolated expressions relating to circuit behavior and electrical relationships appear without complete derivational continuity. These mathematical references often focus on component interactions, frequency relationships, or energy behavior within oscillating systems. However, they are not consistently connected into a full analytical framework that would allow complete reconstruction of system logic. In several instances, the notation suggests intermediate reasoning steps, but without preceding or concluding derivations. This fragmentation limits their interpretive scope, leaving them as partial indicators of design thinking rather than finalized computational models. Modern analysis is limited by the absence of full schematic continuity and consistent experimental documentation. Without complete diagrams, sequential design notes, or verified testing records, researchers must interpret these references in isolation. This creates inherent uncertainty in reconstructing intended system behavior, as relationships between components cannot be fully confirmed. The challenge is not the absence of information entirely, but the absence of complete structural linkage across surviving material. Even small gaps in circuit continuity can significantly alter interpretation of intended functionality in high-frequency systems. The references persist as partial systems, without ever resolving into a complete operational form within the surviving material. Notes: referencing directed energy systems. Electrical energy behavior described in Nikola Tesla's later technical material includes considerations that extend beyond conventional models of transmission and distribution. These descriptions do not present a departure from established electrical principles, but instead appear to examine how energy behaves when conventional boundaries of routing, dispersion, and containment are altered under experimental conditions. The language remains technical and restrained, focused on observable behavior rather than conceptual abstraction, which makes the references more aligned with engineering investigation than theoretical speculation. In several instances, the phrasing suggests incremental refinement of ideas rather than a single unified proposal, as though the work was being adjusted through repeated observation rather than formalized design. In standard electrical theory, energy flow is typically understood through well-defined principles governing current, voltage, and field propagation. These principles allow predictable analysis of how electrical systems distribute power across circuits and through space. Within this framework, any deviation from expected flow behavior is generally attributed to known variables such as resistance, inductance, capacitance, or external interference. This established baseline is important because the later material does not reject these principles, but appears to explore conditions where their interaction becomes more complex under modified configurations. The emphasis remains on measurable electrical behavior, even when outcomes are described in less conventional terms. Certain notes introduce configurations where energy appears to be examined in terms of directional concentration rather than uniform dispersion. This shift in focus suggests attention not only to how electrical energy moves, but also to how it can be shaped or guided within a defined spatial region. The descriptions remain incomplete, often lacking full circuit context, yet they consistently imply that energy distribution was being considered as something that could be influenced beyond standard linear transmission models. In some fragments, the idea is presented alongside adjustments in system setup, though without clear indication of final configuration or intended operational result. Conceptual links appear between these materials and earlier studies involving high-voltage systems and resonant electrical behavior. Both domains rely on the manipulation of electrical fields under controlled conditions, where frequency, intensity, and system configuration directly affect performance. The transition from resonance studies to energy direction considerations does not indicate a break in scientific continuity, but rather an extension of interest toward how similar principles behave when applied at different scales or under altered constraints. This continuity suggests progression within a single experimental trajectory rather than separate lines of inquiry, with each stage building on the same foundational electrical principles. Some material includes partial references to modifying or influencing the spatial characteristics of electrical output. These fragments do not describe complete systems, but instead present isolated ideas related to shaping how electrical energy is distributed in space. In engineering terms, this could involve variations in electrode configuration, field alignment, or oscillation control, though the documentation does not provide enough detail to confirm specific implementation. In several cases, these references appear adjacent to high-voltage experimental notes, suggesting that energy behavior was being examined under conditions where field intensity and spatial structure were actively manipulated. No complete and independently verifiable system design is preserved that outlines a fully realized directed energy configuration. While the concept of focusing or directing energy appears in multiple fragments, there is no surviving documentation that connects these ideas into a functioning end-to-end system. This absence is significant in technical terms, as operational systems require clearly defined input, control mechanisms, and output behavior. Without these elements fully documented, the material remains within the realm of partial conceptual engineering rather than confirmed applied technology. Even where multiple fragments align thematically, they do not converge into a single reconstructible design. Several entries suggest attention to how electrical intensity behaves when constrained or shaped under specific experimental conditions. This includes consideration of how energy density might vary under different configurations, particularly when systems are driven outside typical operating ranges. In physical terms, such behavior would be influenced by field geometry and system impedance, both of which determine how energy is distributed within a given environment. However, the notes do not provide enough structured data to determine whether these observations were theoretical, experimental, or observational in nature. The lack of measurement context further limits the ability to classify these entries with certainty. There is no documented evidence linking these conceptual references to operational or industrially deployed technology. While Tesla's broader work is firmly connected to practical electrical systems, these specific references do not appear in verified engineering applications. This separation reinforces the distinction between exploratory technical thinking and implemented technological systems. As a result, the material remains classified within historical documentation as uncompleted or non-validated design exploration, preserved only through partial archival survival rather than full engineering record. Isolated fragments describe components and relationships without forming a complete or continuous system architecture. These fragments include references to electrical interactions and structural arrangements, but they do not assemble into a coherent operational design. In engineering documentation, such discontinuity typically indicates either early-stage conceptual work or incomplete preservation of experimental records. The lack of structural continuity makes it impossible to determine how the individual elements were intended to function together, even when individual parts appear technically consistent on their own. Modern analysis remains limited by incomplete documentation, preventing full reconstruction of intended experimental structure. Without complete schematics, sequential notes, or verified testing records, interpretation must rely on partial information that cannot be fully validated. This creates an inherent constraint in understanding how the system was expected to operate, if at all. The absence of contextual linkage between fragments further complicates attempts to reconstruct experimental intent with precision, leaving gaps that cannot be resolved through inference alone. The material consistently occupies a transitional space between theoretical exploration of electrical behavior and incomplete experimental articulation. This positioning suggests ongoing investigation rather than finalized engineering outcomes, where concepts were actively being examined but not fully resolved into operational systems. Across the surviving fragments, the pattern remains consistent: exploration without closure, direction without integration, and design without completion. Directed energy concepts are implied, yet none progress beyond fragmented design notes into a functioning system. FBI files with heavy redactions. Declassified materials tied to Nikola Tesla's recovered archive reveal extensive redaction across multiple technical documents, where large portions of text have been deliberately obscured from public view. Rather than isolated omissions, these blacked-out sections appear repeatedly throughout the files, affecting both explanatory passages and supporting technical details. The visible portion suggests structured scientific content, but the missing segments prevent a complete understanding of the original documentation. What remains is not a full record, but a partial outline shaped as much by absence as by preservation, where interpretation begins only at the edge of what is allowed to be seen. Across multiple pages, the redactions do not appear randomly placed, but instead follow a consistent pattern that interrupts specific types of technical explanation. Electrical descriptions, schematic annotations, and detailed procedural notes are often the most affected sections. In several instances, diagrams remain partially visible, while their explanatory labels are entirely removed, leaving only structural outlines without interpretive guidance. This selective removal creates a document environment where visual information persists, but its meaning is deliberately constrained, as though the informational instructions have been separated from the mechanism they describe. This pattern suggests a form of editorial control that distinguishes between different layers of technical content, rather than treating all information equally. Some sections retain numerical data or isolated technical terms, while adjacent explanations are entirely removed. In certain cases, even references to measurement conditions remain intact, while the context that explains their significance is missing. The inconsistency in what is preserved and what is hidden makes it difficult to determine whether the redactions were based on sensitivity, classification level, or broader interpretive restrictions applied during review, leaving the logic of removal itself partially obscured. This selective removal of content creates a fragmented informational structure, where the remaining text suggests advanced theoretical or experimental discussion, but lacks the necessary continuity for full reconstruction. Even when formulas or descriptions remain intact, surrounding context is often missing, making it difficult to determine the full scope or application of the material. The result is a body of work that is technically suggestive but structurally incomplete, requiring inference rather than direct interpretation. Meaning is no longer carried by complete sequences, but by isolated surviving segments that resist full integration. In some cases, the redacted sections appear to interrupt explanatory sequences at points where technical reasoning would normally transition between steps. This produces a noticeable break in logical flow, where a concept begins clearly, then suddenly continues without the intermediate explanation that would normally connect the ideas. These interruptions are not uniform in length or placement, which further complicates attempts to reconstruct the original structure of the material. The absence is not just visual, it is procedural, removing the connective logic that would normally guide interpretation. The documents also show variation in how much surrounding context is preserved around redacted areas. Some pages retain enough information to infer the general subject of a passage, while others provide only minimal reference points, leaving the topic itself uncertain. In more complete sections, patterns of notation suggest structured experimentation, but even there, key explanatory anchors are missing. This uneven preservation creates a layered archive in which different documents offer different levels of interpretive access, preventing a consistent reading of the material as a unified body of work. Over time, this inconsistency produces an effect where certain ideas appear repeatedly across documents, but never in a fully complete form. Concepts can be recognized through recurring terminology or partial diagrams, yet their full development is never fully visible in any single location. This repetition without completion introduces a structural echo across the archive, where ideas seem present but never fully resolved, existing in a state between documentation and disappearance. What becomes most significant is not only the presence of redaction, but the way it consistently shapes the remaining information into partial narratives. The documents do not simply lose data, they actively shift into incomplete frameworks where meaning is implied rather than fully expressed. This creates a layered record where absence plays a structural role alongside what is still visible, influencing how the material can be understood as much as the surviving content itself. No single document within the available set provides a complete unredacted view of the technical material in its original form. Instead, understanding emerges through fragmented reconstruction, where interpretation depends on what remains accessible rather than what was originally recorded. This limits the ability to form definitive conclusions about the full scope of the underlying scientific content, leaving each surviving fragment dependent on the next for partial context that is never fully complete. The structure of what is missing begins to define the structure of what remains. Tesla's nephew and the disputed property claim. Following the initial handling of Nikola Tesla's recovered materials, questions of ownership extended beyond institutional custody, into matters of legal inheritance. Among the documented claimants, Sava Kosanovic, Tesla's nephew and a Yugoslav diplomat, became a central figure in efforts to recover portions of Tesla's personal estate. His involvement introduced a separate dimension to the handling of the materials, where scientific documentation became intertwined with legal and familial rights. What began as an administrative custody process gradually expanded into a dispute shaped by inheritance, jurisdiction, and historical legacy, rather than purely scientific evaluation. The process of determining rightful ownership was complicated by the dual nature of Tesla's belongings, which included both personal items and scientific documentation. At the time of review, distinctions between private property and materials considered of governmental interest were not always clearly defined. This ambiguity created procedural uncertainty, requiring multiple levels of administrative review before any decisions regarding release or retention could be finalized. In practice, classification often depended on interpretation rather than strict categorical separation, especially when technical notebooks blurred the line between personal record and scientific archive. As the claim developed, it intersected with broader political and diplomatic considerations, reflecting Tesla's international background and the significance of his scientific legacy beyond the United States. Records indicate that discussions surrounding the estate were not confined to a single authority, but involved coordination between different institutional bodies. This expanded the scope of the case beyond a private inheritance matter into a subject of broader administrative and national interest, where scientific value, cultural identity, and institutional responsibility became closely linked in parallel rather than isolated discussions. The materials under discussion were not limited to personal belongings, but included notebooks, technical papers, and experimental documentation attributed to Tesla's scientific work. Their classification within the estate complicated efforts to separate personal inheritance from scientific archive material. Some items were clearly personal in nature, while others contained detailed technical reasoning, calculations, or conceptual frameworks that made their categorization less straightforward. Even seemingly routine notes occasionally contained references to experimental conditions or theoretical constructs, increasing the difficulty of assigning consistent archival labels across the collection. Over time, portions of Tesla's materials were released and transferred out of government custody, with certain items eventually making their way into Yugoslav archival institutions. However, documentation does not present a fully transparent accounting of what was returned versus what remained retained or previously reviewed. Records describe transfers in general terms, but do not consistently preserve item-level detail across the entire collection. This incomplete clarity leaves the recovery process partially defined by administrative summaries rather than exhaustive documentation, where broad movement is recorded but precise contents remain unevenly tracked. Even after the resolution of key claims, the broader structure of Tesla's archive materials remained only partially reconstructed. The separation between what was returned and what remained under institutional control contributes to ongoing gaps in the continuity of the overall record. These gaps are not necessarily indicative of loss, but of uneven documentation practices during transfer and review phases, where procedural focus often outweighed detailed archival preservation. As a result, the estate exists in archival form as a distributed collection rather than a single unified body of materials. The estate documentation itself does not provide a complete continuous account of all materials associated with Tesla at the time of his death. Instead, it is composed of layered records including legal correspondence, transfer summaries, partial inventories, and institutional notes. Each layer captures a different aspect of the process, but none offers a fully complete reconstruction of the original estate as a whole. This fragmented structure makes it difficult to determine the full scope of what was originally contained within Tesla's possessions at any single moment in time, particularly when cross-referencing between sources produces only partial alignment. In this context, interpretation of the estate becomes dependent on overlapping records that do not always align perfectly with one another. Some documents emphasize legal classification, while others focus on administrative handling or partial scientific categorization. These differing perspectives create a multi-layered archive in which no single document provides definitive closure. Instead, understanding emerges through comparison of incomplete sources, each contributing partial clarity without producing a fully unified narrative leaving reconstruction dependent on inference rather than direct continuity. What remains consistent across all records is the presence of unresolved boundaries between personal property and scientific archive material. This distinction continues to shape how Tesla's legacy is organized, stored, and interpreted in institutional contexts. The lack of a fully resolved inventory means that classification itself becomes part of the historical record, reflecting not only what was preserved, but how it was defined at the time of handling, and how those definitions shifted across different stages of review. In the absence of a complete inventory, even administrative structure becomes part of the uncertainty. The way items were grouped, labelled, and reassigned reflects procedural decisions that are not always fully documented in their rationale. This creates a secondary layer of ambiguity where not only the contents but also the system used to categorize them must be interpreted indirectly through fragmented records. Ownership of the archive ultimately became inseparable from the uncertainty surrounding what the archive itself fully contained. Break between seizure inventory and storage records. Archival record systems are often designed with the assumption that every item can be tracked across time without deviation between documentation layers. In principle, each entry is meant to move in a straight line from collection to storage, maintaining continuity through identifiers, classifications, and catalogue references. In the case of materials associated with Nikola Tesla, however, the surviving documentation shows that this continuity did not always remain intact once multiple administrative systems began handling the same collection under different procedural conditions. Tesla's confiscated belongings entered federal custody in 1943 through an initial cataloguing process that assigned formal inventory entries to each recorded item. This stage functioned as a structured seizure record, where objects and documents were logged as they were taken into possession under wartime administrative authority. Each entry was intended to represent a direct accounting of physical transfer, establishing an official baseline of what had been collected at the moment custody was assumed. A second layer of documentation emerged later, where stored materials were re-registered under evolving classification frameworks used by government repositories. These storage records were created independently of the original seizure inventory, reflecting internal organisation within archival facilities, rather than the moment of confiscation itself. As materials moved between departments and storage locations, they were re-entered into systems designed for long-term preservation and reference, introducing a separate descriptive structure alongside the original inventory. Side-by-side comparisons of these record layers reveal instances where identical items fail to appear consistently across both tracking systems. Some entries documented during seizure do not have clearly corresponding storage references, while certain storage listings lack direct traces in the original inventory. The discrepancy does not present itself as a single break or isolated error, but rather as a recurring pattern distributed across categories of materials, including written documents, technical notes, and miscellaneous personal effects. In several cases, the divergence appears at the level of identification rather than physical description. An item may be described in similar terms across both systems, yet carry different reference numbers or be grouped under alternate classifications. These variations complicate direct cross-referencing, as the relationship between entries must often be reconstructed indirectly through context rather than confirmed through matching identifiers. Shifts in classification standards introduced additional variation in how entries were labelled, grouped, and updated across successive archival revisions. As administrative systems evolved over time, cataloguing conventions were adjusted to accommodate new indexing methods, resulting in changes to terminology and organizational structure. While such adjustments are common in long-term archival maintenance, in this case they created additional distance between early seizure records and later storage documentation describing the same collection. Further complexity arises from the fact that some updates appear to have been applied retroactively within storage catalogues without corresponding updates to the original seizure inventory. This creates a layered documentation environment in which one system reflects earlier recording logic, while another reflects later organizational standards, without a fully documented reconciliation process between the two. The result is not contradiction in a strict sense, but structural divergence in how the same material is represented across time. Tracing individual objects through both inventories becomes increasingly complex, where reference numbers diverge or lack direct correspondence. In certain cases, an item recorded under one identifier in the seizure documentation appears under a different structure in storage catalogues, without an accompanying explanation of the transition. In other instances, storage entries reference groups of materials that cannot be fully mapped back to specific initial inventory lines, leaving the relationship between records partially inferential rather than explicitly documented. No formal correction appears in surviving documentation acknowledging or addressing the inconsistencies between the overlapping record systems. The records proceed through successive stages of administrative handling without any preserved note indicating reconciliation between early and later catalogues. This absence does not suggest interruption in process, but rather indicates that each system continued operating according to its own internal logic, even when referencing the same collection. Later archival expansions added revised summaries and reorganized catalogues, further layering the existing record structure with additional interpretive adjustments. These later documents often sought to consolidate earlier records into broader classifications, but in doing so, they introduced new groupings that did not always preserve direct alignment with earlier entries. Over time, the accumulation of revisions created a documentation environment where each layer reflects its own organizational priorities, rather than a single continuous framework. Reconstructed summaries compiled years after the original seizure still fail to produce a fully unified listing across all recorded systems. Even when materials are grouped into consolidated overviews, certain entries remain only partially aligned, with gaps persisting between seizure-era documentation and later storage-based records. These unresolved alignments do not point to a single missing element, but instead reflect a broader structural inconsistency that remains visible across multiple stages of archival handling. Across both inventory and storage frameworks, the recorded history of Tesla's materials never resolves into a single consistent accounting. Contradictory scientific assessments of Tesla's work. Scientific evaluation rarely produces a single uninterrupted conclusion when the material under review spans multiple disciplines and interpretive frameworks. In practice, scientific understanding is often shaped by the tools, assumptions, and priorities of the field applying it, meaning that the same body of work can be read in multiple valid but non-identical ways. In the case of materials associated with Nikola Tesla, this tendency becomes more pronounced when different evaluators attempt to classify ideas that sit between theoretical physics, electrical engineering, and early experimental research. After the death of Tesla, portions of his collected work were subjected to formal assessment by technical experts working within institutional review structures. These evaluations were not conducted in a single unified setting, but rather through a process involving scientific advisors and government-associated analysis channels, tasked with determining whether the materials held any practical or theoretical significance. The purpose of these reviews was not only to understand the content, but also to assess whether any concepts had relevance to contemporary scientific or technological development. Institutional evaluations conducted during this period placed Tesla's materials under examination for both theoretical significance and potential applied relevance. This dual focus meant that reviewers were not only interpreting ideas as scientific concepts, but also considering whether those ideas could translate into functional systems or engineering applications. As a result, assessments often moved between abstract interpretation and practical evaluation, depending on the perspective of the reviewing discipline. Diverging interpretations began to appear as different evaluators emphasized distinct aspects of the same underlying material. Some assessments prioritized the theoretical coherence of Tesla's concepts, focusing on whether his ideas aligned with established scientific principles. Others placed greater emphasis on practical implementation, evaluating whether the concepts could be transformed into usable technologies under existing technological constraints. These differing priorities naturally produced variations in how the same material was understood. Variations in analytical approach contributed to assessments that framed identical concepts in fundamentally different scientific terms. Where one interpretation might describe a concept as speculative extension of known principles, another might characterize it as incomplete but structurally plausible within broader theoretical boundaries. These differences were not necessarily contradictions in methodology, but reflections of how disciplinary framing influences scientific interpretation. Formal reports produced during these evaluations reflect shifts in certainty, with some sections presenting cautious interpretation, while others remain more definitive in tone. In certain instances, evaluators expressed clear limitations regarding the immediate applicability of Tesla's work, while in others, language was more open-ended, acknowledging conceptual depth without committing to practical judgment. The variation in tone suggests that confidence levels were not uniform across all areas of assessment. Methodological differences between disciplines influenced how specific elements of Tesla's work were categorized and understood. Electrical engineering perspectives tended to focus on feasibility and system implementation, while more theoretical approaches were inclined to examine underlying principles and conceptual structure. These differing frameworks did not necessarily oppose each other, but they produced distinct readings of the same material depending on the criteria being applied. In addition to disciplinary variation, the absence of standardized interpretive consensus meant that no single evaluative framework dominated the entire review process. Instead, multiple perspectives coexisted within the broader assessment environment, each contributing partial interpretations without necessarily reconciling them into a unified conclusion. This produced a layered analytical landscape in which meaning was distributed across multiple viewpoints rather than consolidated into one authoritative interpretation. Aggregated summaries compiled from multiple assessments do not converge into a single unified scientific position regarding the material's overall significance. While these summaries attempt to consolidate findings, they often preserve distinctions between different interpretive lines rather than eliminating them. As a result, the final compiled evaluations reflect plurality rather than resolution, maintaining multiple perspectives within a single documented framework. Some sections of the compiled assessments emphasize limitations in practical implementation, noting that certain ideas lacked immediate engineering pathways under the technological conditions of the time. Other sections, however, acknowledge conceptual structures that align in part with known scientific principles, even if not fully developed into testable applications. These parallel observations exist within the same documentation, without being fully reconciled into a singular interpretive stance. Even consolidated interpretations produced after extended review fail to eliminate the separation between competing analytical perspectives. The persistence of multiple readings within the same evaluative record suggests that the material resisted reduction into a single disciplinary classification. Instead, it continued to occupy a space where theoretical interpretation and practical assessment remained partially distinct, depending on the framework applied. What becomes particularly significant is not any single conclusion reached during these evaluations, but the continued coexistence of multiple interpretations that do not fully resolve into agreement. The material does not shift between correct and incorrect readings, so much as it sustains several overlapping interpretations that remain valid within their respective analytical contexts. The same body of Tesla's work continued to generate incompatible scientific interpretations without resolving into a single agreed understanding. Technologies appearing later with similar concepts. Throughout the evolution of scientific development, certain ideas appear to re-emerge across different eras without a clearly traceable line of continuity between them. Scientific progress is often described as cumulative, yet the historical record also contains moments where similar concepts arise independently under different conditions, shaped by separate technological constraints and research environments. In examining such patterns, the focus shifts away from direct inheritance of ideas and toward the broader question of how comparable principles can surface in distinct periods of innovation without documented transmission between them. Within the recorded work of Nikola Tesla, multiple conceptual frameworks were outlined that explored electrical behavior, energy transmission, and wireless systems. His documented ideas include extensive exploration of alternating current systems, high-frequency electrical phenomena, and theoretical approaches to wireless transfer of energy. These concepts were developed within the context of late 19th and early 20th century scientific experimentation, where electrical engineering was still rapidly evolving, and many foundational principles were actively being tested and refined. Some of these recorded concepts describe principles that focus on energy distribution through non-traditional transmission methods rather than conventional wired systems. Tesla's theoretical discussions often emphasize the behavior of energy in relation to distance, resonance, and environmental interaction, proposing mechanisms that extended beyond the dominant engineering models of his time. While not all of these ideas were realized in practical form during his lifetime, they remain part of his documented scientific legacy and continue to be studied within historical and technical contexts. In later technological periods, developments in electrical and communication infrastructure introduce systems that share broad conceptual similarities with earlier theoretical descriptions. Advances in wireless communication, signal transmission, and energy distribution technologies reflect evolving approaches to managing electrical phenomena across distance, often relying on principles that align in general structure with earlier theoretical explorations. These developments emerged within different scientific frameworks and were driven by independent research trajectories within modern engineering disciplines. These similarities are observed at the level of general structure and function, rather than direct technical replication or documented derivation. In comparative analysis, the focus is not on identical mechanisms, but on shared conceptual patterns, such as the movement of signals through space, the manipulation of electromagnetic fields, and the control of energy propagation in controlled environments. Such parallels are typically described in terms of functional resemblance rather than literal technological continuation. No surviving records establish a direct historical pathway, linking Tesla's documented ideas to the later emergence of comparable technological systems. While his work is well documented within scientific archives and historical studies, there is no formal evidence within those records indicating a continuous developmental chain leading directly from his specific theoretical formulations to later engineered implementations. This absence of documented linkage places the relationship between early concepts and later systems within the category of parallel or independent development rather than confirmed inheritance. Analytical discussions surrounding these overlaps typically emphasize independent development as a central explanatory framework within scientific interpretation. In this context, similar ideas can emerge in separate research environments when scientists and engineers confront comparable physical constraints or technological challenges. The recurrence of similar conceptual solutions across time is therefore often understood as a product of convergent problem-solving rather than direct transmission of knowledge. The presence of similar conceptual patterns across different time periods is often examined within broader studies of parallel innovation in scientific history. Such studies consider how different scientific communities, operating under varying technological capabilities, may arrive at related conceptual structures while addressing comparable physical phenomena. This approach treats similarity as an analytical observation rather than evidence of direct historical connection, focusing instead on the conditions that make certain ideas repeatedly viable within scientific development. In this framework, Tesla's documented ideas are viewed as part of a wider continuum of exploratory scientific thought that interacts with later technological progress in indirect and non-linear ways. The relationship between early theoretical work and later engineering systems is therefore interpreted through comparative analysis rather than sequential dependency. This perspective allows for recognition of conceptual similarity without requiring a demonstrable chain of influence between specific historical points. Despite repeated examination of both historical material and later technological frameworks, no unified explanatory sequence has been established connecting them directly. The available records, when viewed collectively, do not produce a single continuous narrative that links Tesla's theoretical explorations to subsequent technological implementations in a linear or documented manner. Instead, the historical and technical evidence remains distributed across separate contexts of development, each shaped by its own scientific environment and methodological approach. What becomes particularly notable in such comparisons is not the assertion of direct connection, but the persistence of recurring conceptual forms across distinct technological eras. These recurring forms suggest that certain scientific ideas may emerge multiple times under different conditions, shaped by the underlying structure of physical laws and the practical demands of engineering challenges, rather than by direct inheritance of earlier formulations. Certain conceptual structures recorded in Tesla's work appear again in later technological developments, without a documented pathway connecting their original formulation to their later emergence. Unverified experimental references in Tesla's notes. Written scientific records can sometimes describe events that exist only as recorded language, rather than independently confirmed occurrences. In the history of scientific documentation, written descriptions have often served as the first trace of an idea, a procedure, or an observation, long before external verification is established or even possible. However, there are also cases where such written references remain isolated within the text itself, never fully connecting to an external record of observation, replication, or independent confirmation. This creates a particular kind of scientific ambiguity, where the existence of a description does not automatically guarantee the existence of a verified event. Materials attributed to Nikola Tesla contain passages that refer to experimental activity recorded in his personal notes and technical writings. These materials, preserved across different collections of his work, include descriptions of experimental setups, observed behaviours of electrical systems, and theoretical arrangements intended to test specific physical principles. While much of Tesla's documented work aligns with established scientific inquiry of his era, certain references within his notes stand apart due to the absence of accompanying external documentation. Some of these written passages describe conditions or procedures associated with experiments that are not accompanied by external confirmation. These descriptions often take the form of structured observations or step-by-step outlines, presenting experimental scenarios in a manner consistent with scientific notation. Yet, unlike fully documented experiments in other scientific contexts, they are not always accompanied by independent reports, witness accounts, or corroborating publications that would normally establish their execution within a broader scientific record. Across available historical records, there is no accompanying independent documentation that directly verifies the execution of several referenced experimental descriptions. This absence does not necessarily indicate that the experiments did not occur, but rather that no external source within the surviving archival material confirms their observation or repetition. In scientific methodology, the presence of independent verification is typically a key component in establishing whether a described experiment can be considered empirically validated. The style of notation within these writings shifts between technical outlining and descriptive reporting, without consistently separating planned activity from completed observation. In some sections, the language suggests preparatory design or theoretical exploration, while in others it reads as if describing results or outcomes. This overlap between planning and reporting creates interpretive complexity, as the structure of the notes does not always clearly distinguish between hypothetical construction and executed experimentation. Conventional experimental practice relies on reproducibility or external witnessing as a means of establishing validity for recorded results. In most scientific disciplines, an experiment gains credibility through repetition, under controlled conditions, or through independent observation by other researchers. This framework allows findings to move from individual observation to collectively accepted knowledge. In cases where such corroboration is absent, the status of the recorded material remains within the category of unverified description. References preserved in Tesla's writings remain situated outside that verification structure, existing only through textual documentation. These passages are preserved as written records without accompanying external confirmation that would place them within a reproducible experimental framework. As a result, they occupy a distinct position within historical scientific material, documented in form but not fully anchored in independently confirmed experimental history. Academic interpretation typically classifies such material as unverified experimental reference rather than confirmed empirical evidence. In this context, unverified does not imply invalid or incorrect, but rather indicates the absence of external corroboration within surviving records. Scholars and historians generally approach such material with caution, treating it as part of the conceptual or exploratory dimension of scientific work unless additional supporting evidence is available. When examined in relation to Tesla's broader body of work, these references appear alongside fully documented inventions and experimentally validated systems, making their status more complex within the overall historical record. His contributions to alternating current systems, electrical engineering, and wireless transmission are well established through both documentation and practical application. Against this backdrop, the presence of unverified experimental descriptions introduces an additional layer of interpretive nuance rather than replacing or contradicting his confirmed achievements. In some cases, the written descriptions are highly detailed, outlining specific configurations, conditions, or expected outcomes of experimental arrangements. These details suggest a level of structured planning consistent with scientific methodology, yet they remain isolated within the written record without corresponding external validation. The absence of corroborating material prevents these descriptions from being fully integrated into the confirmed experimental timeline of his work. Scholarly discussion of such references often emphasizes the importance of distinguishing between conceptual proposal an empirically verified experiment. Within historical analysis of scientific figures, it is not uncommon for notebooks and personal writings to contain ideas that were never formally tested or publicly demonstrated. However, in the case of Tesla's notes, the level of technical specificity in some passages contributes to ongoing interpretive interest regarding their intended status. Even when reviewed as a collective body of work, these references do not align with any independently documented experimental sequence. There is no continuous chain of external evidence that connects the written descriptions to verified demonstrations or replicated results within the historical scientific record. Instead, they remain as isolated textual entries, existing within the broader archive of his work without external anchoring and experimental confirmation. This separation between written description and verified observation places these references within a distinct category of scientific documentation, where the existence of recorded detail does not automatically extend into confirmed empirical history. The material is therefore interpreted within a framework that acknowledges both its technical specificity and its lack of external validation, maintaining a careful distinction between documentation and verification. The experimental descriptions preserved in Tesla's notes exist without any external record confirming that the referenced activities were ever independently observed or verified. Claims of a hidden experimental laboratory location. Physical space determines the limits and possibilities of experimental work, shaping how controlled observation can actually take place and how results become repeatable under consistent conditions. In the history of science, ideas are often treated as the most visible part of discovery, yet every idea depends on an invisible foundation of environment, structure, and physical constraint. Laboratories are not just background settings, but active components of experimentation, influencing what can be tested, how instruments behave, and what kinds of phenomena can be observed under controlled conditions. Historical documentation tied to Nikola Tesla consistently situates his major research periods within identifiable laboratory environments used during his active scientific career. These include his well-documented work in New York, Colorado Springs, and other established locations where his electrical and wireless experiments were conducted and recorded. Each of these sites is supported through historical accounts that describe not only the presence of equipment and apparatus, but also the structured progression of his experimental investigations during those periods. Occasional references within related historical material describe additional working environments where experimental activity is implied but not firmly grounded in verified location data. These references do not present themselves as formal declarations of new laboratories, but rather as indirect mentions embedded within broader descriptions of his work. They appear in ways that suggest activity outside the most widely recognized sites, though without the consistency or detail required to establish them as confirmed locations within the historical record. Such descriptions appear without stable geographic anchors, often existing as partial references embedded within broader accounts of his work. In some cases, the language used points toward conditions of experimentation rather than physical coordinates, describing environments in terms of function rather than identifiable place. This makes it difficult to separate metaphorical or contextual description from literal reference to physical space, especially when the surrounding material does not provide additional clarification. No consolidated historical record establishes the existence of any officially recognized laboratory beyond the confirmed sites associated with Tesla's documented research. The archival and biographical material available to historians consistently centers on a limited set of verified locations, each of which can be placed within a coherent timeline of his scientific development. Within these records, there is no formal expansion of his laboratory network beyond those established environments that are already well documented. Between verified laboratory locations and loosely described environments, a spatial discontinuity emerges within the historical mapping of his experimental activity. This discontinuity does not indicate contradiction within the documented record itself, but rather highlights the difference between confirmed physical sites and references that lack precise geographical definition. As a result, the full spatial scope of referenced activity cannot always be aligned with a single, continuous geographical framework. Throughout scientific history, multi-site experimentation is common, yet it is typically supported by clear documentation linking each location within a coherent sequence. Researchers often move between laboratories, field sites, and testing environments, But these transitions are generally recorded in a way that preserves continuity across different phases of experimental work. In well-documented cases, each location can be traced as part of an organized progression of research activity. Surviving records connected to Tesla do not consistently provide that level of spatial linkage across all referenced experimental contexts. While his confirmed laboratory sites are well established, the broader network of environments implied in some historical descriptions does not form a fully traceable sequence. This creates a situation where certain references exist adjacent to documented history without being fully integrated into a continuous spatial narrative. In examining the structure of historical documentation, it becomes clear that the distinction lies not in the existence of his laboratories, but in the completeness of their spatial representation across all associated references. Verified locations are clearly defined, while supplementary references remain less precise, creating a layered understanding of where and how experimental activity may have been distributed. Consequently, portions of his experimental environment remain recorded in fragments that do not resolve into a unified geographical framework. These fragments do not necessarily contradict established locations, but they exist outside the same level of spatial certainty, leaving gaps in how the full scope of experimental settings is understood within historical accounts. The full range of physical locations associated with Tesla's experimental activity cannot be reconstructed into a single continuous spatial record across surviving historical documentation. The trunk sent to Belgrade, transporting scientific archives across national boundaries, often reshapes how the preserved material is later organized, interpreted and contextualized, because the act of relocation is never purely logistical. It also becomes an administrative transformation, where materials move not only through space, but through different systems of classification, preservation standards, and institutional priorities. In cases involving historically significant scientific figures, these transitions can subtly alter how completeness, continuity, and traceability are maintained across successive stages of archival handling. After Nikola Tesla's death, remaining collections of his work entered formal custodial management under institutions responsible for preserving his scientific legacy. This phase involved the consolidation of documents, personal papers, and technical materials that had been retained after earlier periods of governmental and institutional handling. The objective at this stage was to ensure that surviving materials were stabilized, organized, and prepared for long-term preservation under structured archival conditions. Grouping and preparation of these materials required sorting diverse documents, technical notes, and related items into transport-ready collections. Items were organized according to broad categories of content and physical condition, ensuring that fragile materials and technical papers could be moved without unnecessary deterioration. This process did not alter the contents themselves, but it did determine how they would be physically arranged during relocation, influencing the structure of the containers in which they were eventually placed. Inside several of the prepared containers were trunks used to physically hold mixed archival contents during international relocation. These trunks served as primary transport units, designed to accommodate heterogeneous materials ranging from written manuscripts to supplementary documentation. Their role was functional rather than interpretive, providing a means of physically consolidating materials that originated from different phases of Tesla's working life into manageable units for transfer. Transfer operations eventually moved these trunks to Yugoslav archival institutions in Belgrade, where they were integrated into national preservation systems. This relocation represented the movement of historically significant scientific materials into a new institutional environment tasked with their long-term conservation and study. The transition involved not only physical transport but also the re-establishment of custodial responsibility under a different archival framework with its own classification practices. Arrival procedures involved cataloguing and incorporation of the transported materials into local archival structures responsible for historical documentation. Once the trunks reached their destination, their contents were unpacked, assessed, and entered into institutional records according to the archival standards in place at the receiving institution. This stage marked the beginning of a new documentation phase, where materials were no longer simply transported objects, but active entries within a structured archival system. Cross-referencing earlier custody listings with later Belgrade records reveals differences in how certain items are represented across documentation stages. Some materials appear in both records with similar descriptions, while others show variations in categorization, grouping, or descriptive detail. These differences do not necessarily indicate loss or alteration of physical content, but they do reflect changes in how the same materials were recorded under different archival frameworks. Preservation methods applied after relocation followed institutional standards that were not identical to those used in the original custodial environment. Variations in cataloguing systems, descriptive conventions, and archival structuring influenced how materials were integrated into the receiving institution's collection. Over time, these differences shaped the way researchers and archivists encountered the materials within their new organizational context. Documentation associated with the transfer process does not always maintain one-to-one alignment between recorded items and their later archival classification. While general continuity is preserved at the level of major groupings, finer distinctions between individual items can become less directly traceable across different documentation stages. This creates a layered archival structure in which the same material may be represented through multiple descriptive frameworks, depending on the point in the transfer and cataloguing process. In some cases, materials listed during earlier custodial phases appear under modified descriptions after relocation, reflecting shifts in cataloguing terminology rather than confirmed changes to the physical contents themselves. These adjustments are consistent with standard archival practice when integrating collections into new institutional systems, where terminology is often adapted to match local classification conventions and historical documentation standards. The relationship between pre-transfer inventories and post-transfer records therefore reflects a transition not only of physical objects, but also of descriptive systems. Each stage of documentation captures the materials through the lens of its own organizational logic, resulting in records that are accurate within their respective contexts, but not always directly interchangeable without interpretive alignment. Even when examined collectively, the documentation surrounding the relocation does not fully resolve into a single uninterrupted record of every item from origin to destination. Instead, it presents a structured sequence of handling stages in which materials are consistently preserved, but their descriptive representation shifts according to institutional context. The physical transfer of Tesla's archived materials to Belgrade does not present a completely continuous record of every item accounted for throughout the relocation process.